Mr. Boutros, your next witness.
Your Honor, the plaintiffs called Dr. Elon Meyer.
Raise your right hand, please. Elon Meyer called as a witness to the plaintiffs herein, having been first duly sworn, is examined and testified as follows.
I do.
Thank you. State your name, please,
My name is Elon Meyer,
and spell your last name.
Meyer.
And your first name?
Ilan.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Meyer.
Yeah, good afternoon.
I would like to start by asking you a few questions about your educational background. Where did you receive your undergraduate degree?
I received a BA from Tel Aviv University in Israel. I received a BA from Tel Aviv University in psychology and special education.
Do you have a master's degree?
Yes, I received a master's degree in psychology from the New School for Social Research in New York City.
Do you have a pre-doctoral fellowship of any kind?
Yes. After the master's degree, I moved to the doctoral program at Columbia University. And during this program, I had a National Institute of Mental Health fellowship in psychiatric epidemiology.
And what is psychiatric epidemiology?
Psychiatric epidemiology is the study of mental disorders. We are interested in patterns of mental disorders, causes of mental disorders, risks for mental disorders, very much like epidemiology of infectious diseases, where we are looking at the infections, but this is concerning psychiatric disorders such as depression, anxiety, and so forth.
Dr. Meyer, do you have a PhD?
I do.
And from where did you receive it?
From Columbia University.
And when did you receive it?
In 1993.
And in what field did you receive your PhD?
The department where I got the PhD is called Socio-Medical Sciences. It's a department that brings together people from various social sciences and studying of public health problems or public health issues. In my case, mental disorders. But other people may study other types of disorders.
Okay, and did you do a doctoral dissertation?
I did.
And what was the title of it?
The title of it was Prejudice and Pride, Minority Stress, and Mental Health in Gay Men.
All right, and did it receive any awards?
It was chosen for distinction by the university, which is given to the top 10% of dissertations at the university, Columbia University.
Did you do any postdoctoral fellowship?
I did. After finishing my PhD, I did 3 years of postdoctoral work. They were funded also by the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. The first one was a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at City University of New York, the Graduate Center, and that was in health psychology. The second one was at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and that was in HIV, AIDS, and psychiatry.
Okay. Dr. Meyer, let's talk a little bit about your employment. What's your current employment position?
I'm an associate professor at the Department of Socio-Medical Sciences, the same department where I graduated. I'm also the executive chair for the department in charge of our master's program, which has about 100 students a year entering to this master's degree.
And this is Columbia University?
Exactly.
At the Mailman School of Public Health?
Yes.
Do you chair any programs within your department?
Yes. Well, first, I co-chair what we call the steering committee for the school, entire school. That is the School of Public Health. And the steering committee is a faculty committee that represents the academic and other issues that the faculty has in terms of direction of the school and in terms of programs and so forth. So so I'm a co-chair on that committee. I also chair the departmental committee on MPH, Masters of Public Health degree. As I said, I'm in charge of that program. I'm also involved or sit in on our curriculum committee, which is the committee that determines what the students should learn in terms of receiving their degrees. I probably have some other committees that I am on. That is quite a bit of...
That's a good start. Thank you. What year did you join the faculty of Columbia University?
My first appointment in '94, but that was while I was still doing my postdoctoral degree. But I think my first full-time appointment is in '96.
And you've been there consistently?
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about what you do professionally. Has your professional, let me step back. It's been, close to 20 years since you got your doctorate.
It is.
Has the professional work you've done over that period focused on any particular topics?
Yes. Yeah. My area of study I would define as social epidemiology. The terms that are maybe not that self-explanatory, but if I had to explain it, I study the relationship between social issues, social factors in the structure of our society, and the way things happen in our society, and health patterns, health outcomes, and specifically mental health outcomes.
Okay, and that's within the field of social epidemiology.
Yeah, that's within the field, I guess, of psychiatric epidemiology. And social epidemiology would be one approach within that field.
Let me see if I have that. Your area of study is the relationship of social structures and mental health outcomes.
Yes, within psychiatric epidemiology, which more broadly discusses and studies patterns and causes of mental disorders.
Fine.
Dr. Meyer, could you please tell the court, has your work focused on any particular groups of the population?
Yes, most directly I have been studying lesbian, gay, and bisexual populations within this area. I have also studied other populations. I've studied African Americans. I have studied other issues such as asthma and HIV, but most of my work has been on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and mental health issues.
Have you made any presentations at professional conferences in the course of your work?
Yes, I've made many presentations. I think most of them are listed in my CV, but maybe not all of the major ones. I would say there are over 40 listed there.
Okay. Have you received any research grants, sir?
Yes, I have received funding for my research. Currently, I am a recipient of the Robert Wood Johnson's Foundation Health Policy Investigator Award. I've received in the past grants from the National Institutes of Health and the National Library of Medicine, from New York State Department of Health, from private foundations, etc.
Okay. Have you received any awards for your professional work?
I have.
And what are some of those?
I guess most recently I received an award for Distinguished Scientific Contribution from the American Psychological Association's Division 44. Which is a division of the American Psychological Association that concerns gay, lesbian, and bisexual health.
Have you been a reviewer or editor of any publications?
Many times. That's part of what we do. I've reviewed many manuscripts that were to be published and would assess them for their value and recommend to the editor about, and critique the manuscripts and so forth. I've also been a guest editor on a couple of journals. A major one, when I was invited to guest edit the American Journal of Public Health, special issue on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender health. This was the first issue that was published on the topic by the American Journal of Public Health, which is a very prestigious journal. It's been around for, I would say, close to 100 years. It was a very successful issue. It actually is the first issue that sold out in memory of anybody, which is a very rare thing for a scientific journal.
Not the highest circulation.
No. After that, I edited or co-edited another journal. Again, this is a special issue of a journal, so the journal is published regularly. But I, in this case, edited a special issue of American Journal of Public Health. And the second one was called Social Science in Medicine. In that case, I co-edited with two colleagues a special issue that focused on prejudice and stigma. Yeah, and their impact in public health and different issues within public health of how we should think about prejudice and stigma.
Okay, have you edited any books, sir?
Yes, right, in part because of the success of the American Journal of Public Health issue, I was invited by the editors in Springer publication, at the time it was Kluwer, and they asked me to edit a book on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender public health issues, which I did with a co-editor also.
Okay, have you written any articles?
Yes, I have written articles, both peer-reviewed articles and articles that were more of a commentary or editorial nature and chapters and so forth.
Okay, can you approximate how many articles you've written?
I think there are 44 peer-reviewed articles listed on my CV right now, and maybe 12 other types, commentaries and so forth.
Dr. Meyer, do you teach students as part of your position at Columbia?
Yes.
And what courses do you teach?
Currently, I teach 3 courses, not at the same time, but there are 3 courses that I currently teach. The first one is a course in research methodology, such as how to conduct surveys and things like that. That's a required course for our students. There are also 2 seminars that I teach. One is called Prejudice, Stigma, and Discrimination as Social Stressors. And that one is a course on gay and lesbian issues in public health.
Hey, Dr. Meyer, you have a witness binder in front of you. If you could turn to the very last tab, which is Plaintiff's Exhibit number 2328.
Yes.
Okay. If you could take a look at that document.
That's my CV.
That's your CV. That was my question. Your Honor, plaintiffs would tender Dr. Elin Meyer as an expert in public health with a focus on social psychology and psychiatric epidemiology.
Vardir?
No objection to this.
No objection to him being qualified to offer his opinions?
No objection to him being qualified as an expert witness.
Very well.
Oh, and Your Honor, with respect to the exhibits, to try to keep things efficient, what we have done is counsel and I have agreed on a list of documents that will be admitted together. I understand that that list has been provided to you and to the clerk. I'd be happy to read them, but it would be better for you if we could just agree. I mean, I suspect it's not. If we could agree that those documents will be admitted.
This is 5 pages.
It is 49 exhibits, I believe.
49 exhibits. If there's no objection, each of these will be admitted.
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel.
Okay. 2 straightforward questions about those exhibits that were just admitted into evidence. With the exception of 3 of them, which are exhibits 973, 975, and 976, is it true that each of the documents that has just been admitted into evidence that's in your binder is a document that you relied on in forming the opinions that you intend to offer in this case?
Yes. Based on my examination of this previously, yes.
And the 3 exhibits that I mentioned, 973, you can take a look at them if you like. 973, 975, and 976. Those are documents that came up in the course of your deposition testimony in this case and that were referenced by you in that testimony.
Yes. What was the third one? I'm sorry.
976.
Okay, yes, that is correct.
Okay. Now, Dr. Meyer, do you intend to offer any opinions in this litigation here today?
Yes, I do.
And what opinions do you intend to offer?
Well, my opinion really describes the work that I have been doing, as I described it earlier, and I would say there are 3 elements there. The first one is on the nature of stigma, and I will testify to the effect of stigma on gay and lesbian populations with reference to Proposition 8 as an example of a stigma. The second part will describe a model of minority stress that is a model that I created with authoring and it has been referred to in much literature on gay and lesbian health. And I will describe how social stressors affect gay and lesbian populations. And the third part describes the effect of those stressors on health, in particular mental health.
Okay, and on what do you base the opinions that you are going to testify about today?
As I said, this is a topic of my study for, as you said, for the past 20 years. Really, since my work on my dissertation. And the opinion is based on many research articles, both some that I've conducted myself and many more that were conducted in the field over many years. And I rely on this body of evidence. A sample of it, I guess, would be what you offered as an exhibit, which is what I relied on in writing a report earlier.
So, Dr. Meyer, let's start talking a little more detail about each of these opinions. Let's start with the first one, which you said refers to stigma experienced by gay men and lesbians. Can you define what you mean by stigma as you use that word?
Yes. And I have to say that I have to be very brief in this description. The work on stigma has many, many volumes that I'm sure we don't want. As I said, it's the subject of the whole seminar that I teach. But the most succinct, I guess, description would be that a group in society has some kind of attribute that has been identified to be a negative attribute, that is seen as negative by society. And this attribute is attached to persons who are believed to have this attribute. And because of having this attribute, they are therefore what we call devalued. So in the example of gay sexual orientation is identified as such an attribute that people perceive as being a negative attribute. And therefore, gay and lesbian people as a whole, I don't mean as a whole, the whole person is identified by that identity that is devalued. And therefore, the whole person is devalued because of that relationship. And stigma, of course, has been applied to many other populations and instances.
Are you familiar with a concept referred to as structural stigma?
Yes.
And what is structural stigma?
Structural stigma refers to, in a sense, the origins of the stigma and the mechanisms that maintain and enact stigma. So those refer, by the word structural, we mean to say more solid structures in society. So societal institutions such as, of course, the law being an important one, and any other institution that is essential in our society.
Hey, explain a little more, if you would, for the court, the way that laws can play a role in structural stigma.
Laws have a major role in determining access of different, of citizens to different, we call it goods that society can provide, to resources, I guess would be the word. And laws may block or foster access to such resources. In that sense, they enact perhaps for a group that is stigmatized, or rather control the access that various groups may have to a particular institution. So, of course, here we're talking about marriage. And that would be an example of, in this case, a very important institution of marriage. And, of course, the law has a role in determining who can access that institution. And, of course, that would be applicable to other types of examples.
So once a social, a structural stigma is in place, how does it affect people?
So, as I said, structural stigmas determine the access that people have to those resources. I rely on the sociologist that talked about the opportunity structures. The society lays out goals that people, I don't want to say fault, internalize. Yeah, people want to achieve certain goals that we all view as important goals in our lives, such as career and marriage being two important examples of that. And stigma would, as I said, determine the access that people have to those desired goals, to achieving those desired goals.
And has the research found that there are stigmas associated with gay men and lesbians?
Yes, of course.
Well, what are some examples of that kind of stigma?
No, there are really many stigmas and stereotypes that describe kind of how people are perceived. In my work, I have written about the role of intimate relationships and the way intimate relationships have been portrayed. And part of the stereotype that is part of the stigma, the negative attitude or the negative associations with this group, has been for many years that gay people are incapable of relationships, of intimate relationships. They may be undesiring even of intimate relationships. And that certainly, they are not successful at having intimate relationships. And when I say this has been a kind of social stigma, I'm talking about how it has been portrayed in various cultural outlets, as well as in a more organized way in various social interactions, social institutions.
You use the phrase intimate relationships. What do you mean by that?
No, intimate relationships mean relationships that people have. Of course, primary among them would be something like marriage, a husband and a wife, but also other intimate relationships with one's family, one's children, and one's community. And in all of those, again, as people have been described for many years as social isolates, as unconnected, as not as good citizens, in a sense, who partake in society the same way everybody else does, as a pariah, so to speak. So that's what stigma does. And in particular, for gay and lesbian example, I think the issue of intimate relationship, because of the nature of being gay, is about who you choose to be with. That has been a strong source of stigma.
Dr. Meyer, if you could turn in your binder to Plaintiff's Exhibit 1011, please.
Yes?
And this is one of the documents that you've relied on in forming your opinions.
Yes.
What is Exhibit 1011?
Yeah, this is a chapter from a book that I've relied on and that I've used in teaching as an example of, maybe I should say what the book is. So this is a chapter from a book that was published in the 60s, late 60s, and was a very popular book. It was called Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Sex, But Were Afraid to Ask. It was very, very popular. It was published in many, I have a hardcover edition that is the 17th edition of this book that was published in 1969. And I personally remember that book. So, in this book, there are different chapters that aim to educate the public about different issues concerning sexuality. And this particular chapter is concerning male homosexuality.
This book had a wide distribution?
Absolutely.
Could we put up demonstrative 2, please? Okay, I'm going to ask you about this, but I would like to do what I'd like you to do is read the text into the record so it's clear what you're addressing.
Yeah, may I explain something about this?
Of course.
I'm sorry. So the book is written in a question and answer format. And basically the author goes through explaining sexual issues as if there is a question that somebody is asking him about his opinion and various sexual issues, and then he provides the answer. So this is an excerpt of one of those question and answers.
Okay, so the question posed is, what about all the homosexuals who live together happily for years? And the answer is, what about them? They are mighty rare birds among the homosexual flock. Moreover, the happy part remains to be seen. The bitterest argument between husband and wife is a passionate love sonnet, by comparison with a dialogue between a butch and his queen. Live together? Yes. Happily? Hardly. Is this text from this book an example of the stigma that you're talking about, sir?
Yes, I think this is a very dramatic experience of what I was referring to, where, in this case, an educational book portrays the relationship between, in this case, gay men as with great disrespect. I would say ridicule and contempt. So that was kind of, and one example of what I was referring to.
Okay. At what stage in life does stigma begin to affect gay men and lesbians?
Stigma really affects all people in society. because it is a social norm, if you will. It is something that we all in society learn from a very young age. It affects gay and lesbian, this particular stigma affects gay and lesbian, gay men and lesbians in a particular way because it is something that is very pertinent to how they think about who they are. In my mind, this kind of stigma on other stereotypes are very impactful, especially at the younger age. And in particularly in the time of life where gay men and lesbians, usually during their youth, either realize or recognize or know that they're gay and begin to try to understand what that means to them. And of course, the most available reference that they would have is the kind of things that they have learned over their lifetime, over their childhood, socialization that we've all been exposed to. So it affects everybody, but certainly it affects in a very strong way somebody who is maybe coming out and realizing that he or she is gay, and that's what they might believe is what is in line for them.
Okay. Now, Dr. Meyer, you live in New York, correct?
That's true.
Are you familiar with Proposition 8, the ballot initiative that was passed in California?
Yes, I am.
What's your basic understanding of what Proposition 8 did?
Well, Proposition 8 was a proposition that was voted by voters in California, restricted marriage to a man and a woman, and in fact, excluding gay men and lesbians from marriage. And it was a constitutional amendment to the California Constitution.
Okay, and in your view, based on your work in this field, is Proposition 8 a form of structural stigma?
Yes, absolutely. As I described stigma earlier, I would say that law, and certainly a constitutional part of the law, would be a very strong part of, as I described, the social structures that define stigma, that define access. In a very simple way, you can think of it as a block or a gate toward a particular institution, toward attaining a particular goal. So in that sense, it is very much fitting in the definition of structural stigma.
Okay. In what ways does Proposition H impose structural stigma on gay men and lesbians in California?
Well, it imposes by the fact that it denies them access to the institution of marriage. As I said, people in our society have goals that are cherished by all people. Again, that's part of social convention, that we all grow up and are raised to think that there are certain things that we want to achieve in life. And in this case, this Proposition 8, in fact, says that if you are gay or lesbian, you cannot achieve this particular goal.
Now, are you aware, sir, that in California, gay and lesbian couples can register as domestic partnership?
Yes, I am.
Well, in your view, does that eliminate the structural stigma of Proposition 8?
No.
Why not?
When I talk about Proposition 8 and the institution of marriage, I am talking about an institution that has a social meaning. As I described it, this has to do with the aspirations of people to achieve certain goals. And I was not referring, and I don't refer to any tangible benefit that maybe our accompanying marriage or domestic partnership arrangement. So what I am talking about throughout my work and today is really about the symbolic meaning, the social meaning of marriage. It is, I think, quite clear that the young children do not aspire to be domestic partners. But certainly the word marriage is something that many people aspire to. Doesn't mean that everybody achieves that, but at least I would say it is very common, socially approved goal for people as they think, for children as they think about their future, and for people as they develop relationships. For young people, and certainly for people later on, this is a desirable and respected type of goal that if you attain it, it's something that gives you pride and respect.
Well, do you have an opinion as to whether domestic partnerships enjoy a similar symbolic and social meaning?
I have an opinion. And that is that, as I said, I don't think it has the same social meaning. In fact, I don't know if it has any social meaning. I think it has perhaps value in terms of the types of benefits that people receive. But as I was trying to explain, that is not what I'm talking about. And that's not really relevant to my discussion of stigma.
Okay. Let's turn then to your second opinion that you mentioned, which has to do with minority stress. What does minority stress mean as you use that phrase?
Minority stress, I've written a lot of articles about it, so I'm trying to, again, be brief. But it basically describes the types of stressors, which is, I have to try to explain maybe what stress means before I do that. Is it?
Well, let me break it down. Why don't you tell us what stress means?
Okay. So that's perhaps something that's easier to understand. Stress is, well, everybody knows what stress means. but when we talk about stress, what we talk about is the kinds of events and conditions that happen from the outside to the person. And that one of the main definitions is they bring about some kind of change that require adaptation. In that sense, that they are taxing on the person because it requires the person to adjust, so to speak, to this new situation. One of the strongest types of stressors is a life event. And certainly losing a loved one would be a high magnitude type of event. Losing a job is another example of an event. So those are the general, I refer to those as general stressors just because I'm trying to distinguish from the minority stress model that I have written about in regards to gay and lesbian stress. So there's those different, there are different ways that we think about stress, not just life events, but for example, there are also chronic stressors. So for example, unemployment, a prolonged, there are other types that maybe I can explain later if you want.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the types. I believe you referenced acute stress. What would that mean?
So a life event is an acute stressor. That's something that has a beginning and end. It is pretty easily discernible. It happened. And chronic stress is something that is, as I say, prolonged. Well, obviously, there could be a relationship between the two. So losing a job would be a life event, but unemployment that would result from that would be a chronic stress. So they are not totally distinguished. There are other types of stressors that people have written about, and again, this is in general affecting everybody. Another one would be what we sometimes call daily hassles or minor stressors that are just annoyances that happen to people. Maybe just being stuck in traffic for a long time, or being in a long line in bank, or people still go to banks, or in supermarket, I guess. So those would be just daily kind of hassles. And then there is another type of stress that is a little different and maybe a little harder to understand as to why it is a stress. And those have been termed non-events, which means nothing happened. And the reason why a non-event can be stressful is because it is something that was expected to have happened. So the fact that it didn't happen in this case also requires adaptation or adjustment. So, for example, if I've been working in my job for a certain number of years and I expected a certain amount of time, I would receive a promotion. But I didn't receive that promotion, that could be a non-event in a sense, because nothing happened, but it was something that I expected and others expected. It's not just any kind of expectation. So you know, if I bought a lottery ticket and I did not get the prize, it would not be the same type. It is something that it is normal to expect to happen at a particular time. Usually, we are talking about milestones over a lifetime. And certainly marriage will be one of those types of expected events, having children. If you ask little children, they will be the kind of thing that they will tell you about what might happen to them in the future. I will marry, I will have children, I will be a grandparent, things like that that are easily understood in our society.
Are the stressors of the type that you're talking about essentially inputs into people's lives as opposed to the results that they may experience?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, so in the research lingo, I guess we would call those the independent factors. Those are the things that happen from the outside. But in common language, usually when we talk about stress, we think about also the outcome, what we call, which is, I felt stress means usually, I felt kind of distress because of something that happened. And we try to separate those two. So we try to assess the stressor part, the input, and the outcome that resulted from that stressor, which may, and of course, in this case, we study healthy outcomes.
Okay. So now that we've discussed stress, let's go back to the concept of minority stress. What is minority stress?
So, minority stress is an extension of this notion of stress, in that it identifies a source of stress that stems, as I described earlier, from social arrangement, in particular prejudice, stigma, and discrimination. So, in my model, any stress that is related to stigma, prejudice, and discrimination, I would designate it as a minority stressor. And by the way, it could be the exact same type of stressor. So, for example, losing a job, as I said, is a life event. But losing a job due to discrimination is a minority stressor of the same life event. And the reason that we distinguish those two is because we know that there's different impact for those different types of events. And also because this allows us to assess and measure them, I guess, in a way that is more precise for this purpose of understanding these issues of social determinants.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Now, could you turn to Plaintiff's Exhibit 1003 in your binder?
Yes?
And if you would tell the court, what is Exhibit 1003?
This is an article that was published that I have written.
And what's the subject of it?
So the title of this article is Prejudice, Social Stress, and Mental Health in Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Populations, Conceptual Issues and Research Evidence. I published this in 2003 in the journal Psychological Bulletin, which I might add is a very prestigious journal in the field of psychology and quite difficult to get published there. And this article, I would say, best articulates the model of minority stress that I've written about and has been referred to by many other researchers who've used it as a theoretical background for their own studies. So, in fact, there are several hundred studies that result, well, I wouldn't say resulted, but certainly that have used this article, the ideas in this article as a research resource for their own research.
Mm-hmm. Now, does the scholarship on minority stress address minority groups other than gay men and lesbians?
Well, certainly the principles. I have to explain maybe something about how I got to this idea of minority stress, and not to take too much credit, maybe. The ideas behind this theory that are outlined here in this article are not all brand new theories that I just made up or came up for the purpose of this article. Rather, they rely on many years of research. For example, all the research on stress and life events and so forth, that I did not invent that. That has been going on, I would say, since the 1950s. People began to be interested in life events as a source of stress and its impact on health. So what I have done is articulated this within this particular context of gay, lesbian, and bisexual population. So the literature on gay, lesbian, and bisexual population have used this term, minority stress, which I, by the way, also did not invent, but used somebody else's. This was a term that I read about in dissertations that was written on lesbians and and life events. And I thought it was a good term. By the word minority here, I mean sexual minorities, which is a term that is used to describe gay men, lesbians, and bisexuals. So, this refers to gay, lesbian, and bisexual. As you will see later, most of the things in it are quite specific to gay men and lesbians. But the general theories about it apply in broader ways.
So let's talk a little bit more specifically about it. Are there particular processes through which minority stress manifests itself, or can manifest itself in the lives of gay men and lesbians?
Yes. So.
Well, what are those?
This has been. I would say my main contribution is to articulate what we do exactly mean by that when we say that prejudice and stigma has an impact on people. And I describe those as processes that describe what actually happens. Why is that a stressor? And I've described in this article and in other work 4 types of minority stress processes. The first one I've called prejudice events. The second, I'm sorry.
Well, why don't you articulate what the 4 are, and then I'd like to do a little more detail on each one. So if you could just generally describe what the 4 are.
Okay. So the first one is called prejudice events, which encompasses a bunch of concepts. The second one is called expectations of rejection and discrimination. The third one is concealing, which refers to hiding your sexual orientation, in this case, or not being out, as we say sometimes.
Okay.
And the fourth one is internalized homophobia, which refers to the internalization of social attitudes by a gay person or a lesbian.
How did you identify these processes?
As I said, there has been work on each of those topics that I relied on in my work to bring it together to this model that is maybe more concise. While there was work on prejudice, on life events, and there has been certainly a lot of work, for example, on internalized homophobia, ranging to clinical psychological literature. I gathered together these different sources of research and theory to put it together in this particular form, to explain the experiences of gay men and lesbians.
Okay, so let's start with the first one you identified, prejudiced events. What do you mean by prejudiced events?
So, just as I described earlier, the general stress, prejudice events, I refer to the types of stressors that are related to prejudice. So I already gave an example of being fired due to discrimination. That would be a prejudice event. And this, in this case, the prejudice events echo those 4 types of stressors that I mentioned earlier. So that would be the major events, the chronic, the major acute events, the chronic stress, the minor events, we could call them the daily hassles, and the non-events. So that is basically taking, again, the same framework and using it here in this context. As I say, all of this was not as well packaged. So it's not that I just took all of this and copied it into this. I used a lot of research to develop this.
Dr. Meyer, Are the events that you describe as prejudice events different from stress events that may be faced by the rest of the population?
Yes, by definition, they are related to prejudice.
Okay, can you give me a more specific example of prejudice events?
Yes, so in addition to the example I gave, there has to do with events related to discrimination that would include other types of events that people experience. For example, anti-gay violence would be clearly a prejudice event, even though it is not a discrimination. But it is like hate crimes, would be prejudice events in the sense that the person was chosen for this, to be the victim of this crime because of prejudice. So these are the major events. Then there are the chronic stressors, again, that could be resultant from prejudice. In my studies, for example, I have collected data from, in the recent study, about 400 gay men and lesbians. And we asked them about life events that happened to them over their entire life. We have several, many thousands of life events that each of them described. So there would be chronic things like harassment, the children, they were adults who reported that during their childhood, they had been harassed at school. So that's not an event unless there was an event. So we assess each of those for what happened and how it happened. But if somebody says, somebody called me a name over the entire year that I was in third grade, we would talk about it as a chronic stressor. If somebody said, I walked down the street and somebody jumped and attacked me and beat me up, that would be an event, in this case a hate crime probably, but an event related to prejudice. So those are the life events.
Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sorry.
Do prejudice events differ in magnitude based on the research?
So when we say magnitude, we mean how big the event was. And usually what this means is like how much, going back to the definition in a more technical way, how much change did an event require? How much adaptation? So that's why I say losing a job is a very big event. Maybe, certainly the minor events I described, waiting in a line is a very tiny magnitude. But there's another aspect to prejudice event which has been identified, for example, with hate crimes, which is they have a greater psychological impact on the person, on the victim of the hate crime. And that greater impact has to do not so much with the characteristics of the event, but with the social meaning of the event. And I don't want to talk in this room about anything legal, but in fact, hate crimes was challenged as whether it could be constitutional. And one of the reasons why, in my understanding, the Supreme Court allowed it to be a separate crime, in fact, is because of that added social meaning and the added pain. So that even though it's the exact same crime or the same exact event, when it is attached to prejudice and discrimination and stigma, it has a meaning for the victim that makes it worse. And that's how we described it here as well.
Okay. What has the research shown about who commonly perpetrates these prejudice events in the lives of gay men and lesbians?
So when I talk about, perpetrates really, as I described before, I talk about the different levels of, you can say, causes of those events. So at the larger level, really, the way I described earlier structural stigma, we sometimes talk about structural prejudice in a similar way. Those are the things that would determine, that would be the context for example, events. events. An event usually is within a larger context. So we look at both of those. So a person, so those are the structural. And then there are things that we call interpersonal types of events. So the perpetrators might be, on one hand, the state, for example, by creating certain structures. But of course, it is also individuals who do something. So in the example of the hate crime is the perpetrator. In the case of gay men and lesbians or sexual minorities, this is quite distinct from other groups that we think about when we think about prejudice. Unfortunately, often the perpetrators could be family members, even parents and siblings. And some of the stories we've collected, we collect them as short narratives, have been quite dramatic in terms of what some of those respondents reported in terms of what had happened to them in the past. This is, by the way, one of the publications here. And what was, I don't know if I would say surprising, but what was distinctive about it was how many of them reported family members perpetrating such crimes, really. It would be things like rape or homelessness that some of them described. So there is a whole range of potential perpetrators that could be implicated here in what I'm discussing.
Okay. Now, from some of those very serious examples, you also mentioned earlier, I think, a concept of everyday hassles.
Yes.
Are those prejudiced events also?
So in the prejudice literature, we call them daily hassles. Well, some people have called them everyday discrimination events. That's one word. There are other terms that have been used to describe those. And in the same way that a hate crime is more significant because of its social meaning that is attached to it, a minor event could have a greater meaning than similar events that, could have a greater impact than a similar event that had no such meaning. So one could just be an annoyance, and the other one could be or is representing social disapproval. And obviously, they would be felt by the person as to be very different.
Give us, if you would, a couple of examples of daily hassles the research has looked at in the context of prejudiced events.
Yeah, well, there are many, but interesting, I've read the plaintiff's testimony here. I believe on Monday it was. I read it on Tuesday, but the testimony was given on Monday. And I was really struck because one of the things that we hear over and over is forms, filling out forms. And it is kind of bewildering because on one hand you might say, what's the big deal about filling out a form? But gay people do respond to that. And the only way I can explain it is that it is really not anything about the form. It is that the form evokes something much larger for the person. It evokes a social disapproval, a rejection. And often it evokes memories of such events, including large events that have happened maybe in the past. So it is this minor annoyance, most of the time, for most people, to fill out a form. And they probably would never remember that if they were asked to talk about what has happened to them. They would mention major things. But for gay people, I've seen this brought up many times. There are other types of things that gay people report that, again, would be minor under such circumstances, such as maybe treated in a very unfriendly way by one's partner's parents. And certainly, it would not be a nice thing for anybody, but for a gay person that may have, or that does have a very great social meaning of, again, echoing the rejection and disrespect and that they have felt in the past and they continue to feel in society. So that is the relationship between the social meaning and those minor events.
There
Dr.
was-
Meyer, you mentioned forms. What kind of forms are you talking about?
I'm sorry, I mentioned the testimony that was given here, that they talked about forms. What I mean by forms are just any kind of administrative forms that one has to, you have to fill, and in particular where you have to fill your marital status, for example. So a gay person, let's say, really what their experience is, that there is no place for me to put anything there. So either they would say, I'm just going to say single, even though I've been in a relationship the past 40 years, because I just don't want to get into that. In this case, it really doesn't matter. Maybe I'm in a motor vehicle office, and I don't want to get into this whole explanation with the clerk about what does it mean. Or there, maybe might be, I think one of the plaintiffs mentioned crossing out things and writing in things. But my point is, obviously, this is not very demanding to cross out a form and say something else. And I would say, if it was within another context, nobody would remember that maybe the form was not very well written and you had to correct something there. That would not be a memorable event. The only reason that it's memorable is because, as I said, of what it means. And what it means is social rejection. It echoes the kinds of rejections that I've been describing earlier.
Dr. Meyer, to follow up on this, to be sure I understand, you might have applications like at a bank to open an account, or a lease to get an apartment, or a job application. Is that the kind of form you're talking about, where there are boxes to describe your status and not a box that corresponds to your status if you are not married?
Absolutely.
Okay. There was also some testimony on Monday, I believe, about hassles relating to travel, say trying to check into a hotel room to get the type of room you deserved. Would that be the type of
This is very, very similar again, where to me it's not so much what happened, but what does it mean to you as a gay person. So, again, a clerk in a hotel asking you about a king-size bed for a couple would really mean nothing. But for a gay person, it's an area of great sensitivity because it really talks to their rejection and to their rejection of their family members, the people that they feel close to.
Does the fact that you might draw in a box or ultimately get the right size bed make the problem go away for the individual?
No, not at all. Because again, it's not about anything tangible here. It's not, there's nothing really horrible about filling out a form. Some forms.
Well, there can be.
Yeah, but at least small forms. But again, it is not about that effort of the filling out of a form or explaining even to a clerk something about to clarify maybe some mistake. That is not what it's about. It's about, I am gay and I am not accepted here.
You also talked, and I think gave some specific examples about non-events. And these, although they're called non-events, are also in their research treated as prejudiced events.
Right. They are not all treated as a prejudiced event, but when they are related to prejudice, then I would call them prejudice non-events. But there are, for example, somebody may not get a job promotion just because of all kinds of circumstances that maybe everybody expected them to get. So that may not be due to prejudice, but it also could be due to prejudice. Certainly somebody might not marry for all kinds of reasons, not because of anybody blocking their access to the institution of marriage, but for whatever other circumstance in their lives. But it would be a non-event that could be significant because other people will begin to ask, well, are you married? Why aren't you married? Especially if they are of certain ethnic backgrounds where people ask questions like that. So there's expectation that you will get married, that you will have children. And so when I talk about those as prejudice, it is when those things don't happen because of prejudice. And again, parallel to everything else I was saying, in this case, it would have that double meaning, both the impact of the actual event and the content of the actual event, or in this case, non-event, such as not getting married. But for gay men and lesbians, not getting married would also have that social meaning that I just described regarding daily hassles type of things, where not getting married is not just a simple, it's not really simple either way, but it's not a fact of their life. It's also a representation of their position in society, or the way society views them, of the kind of respect, or in this case, disrespect that they experience, of the stigma that I described earlier.
Okay, now, Dr. Meyer, what, if anything, is the relationship between Proposition 8 and the denial of the right to marry, on the one hand, and prejudice events, as you described them?
Yeah, I think it's quite obvious that Proposition 8, by definition, blocks the marriage institution for gay men and lesbians. That is basically what it says. So in that sense, it certainly will be responsible for gay men and lesbian not marrying and having to explain why I have not married. And by explaining why I have not married, you also have to explain, I'm really not seen as equal. My status is not respected by my state or by my country, my fellow citizens. So it's in the very basic definition of structural stigma, it is a block on the way to achieving desirable goals in life.
Now, you've already talked a little bit about some of the plaintiff testimony on Monday. I was hoping that I could show you a couple of examples. Do we have a demonstrative 4 handy? And again, so that the record is clear, so as to what you're commenting on, let me read this testimony from Plaintiff Paul Katami. Question: have you experienced discrimination as a result of being gay? Answer: one example that I remember very clearly is the first time in college with some gay friends going to my first gay establishment, like a restaurant or a bar or a restaurant socially. And we were in an outdoor patio, and rocks and eggs came flying over the fence of the patio. We were struck by these rocks and eggs, and there were slurs. And again, we couldn't see who the people were, but we were definitely hit. And it was a very sobering moment, because I just accepted that as part of our struggle. That's part of what we have to deal with. In the context of prejudiced events, do you have a reaction to this example?
Yes, and as I said before, regarding form, this just seems like a very familiar type of report that a gay person might report. And I don't mean to tell the plaintiff that their experiences are not unique experiences. Certainly within their life they are unique, but they are really not unique. Many people experience those kinds of things. And I think when I read that, what struck me most almost, it may not be what you would notice, but it is that point about it being a very sobering moment, because I think that refers to the registration about this is a meaningful point. This is about who I am. This is something that I have to get used to. When Mr. Katami talks about, that's part of our struggle, It is really a moment where he describes recognizing something that has to do with who he is as a gay person. But other elements of this would be that clearly I would say this was related to hate. In fact, when we assess by the way, when we collect those narratives in my research, we go through a very, very tedious process of analyzing each of those narratives so that we quantify some qualities around them. And one of the things we look at related to hate crime. And we try to use some of the guidelines that police use in determining hate crimes. So in this case, he mentioned being next to a gay establishment, which would be one element that would help in determining a hate crime. But there's something that I don't know here. For example, whether someone was actually hurt, which would go to the issue of magnitude. But regardless of that, yeah, I think what is clear here, that the meaning of this, and I would dare say, not having talked to Mr. Katami and not really knowing anything behind that perhaps one of the main reasons that it's so memorable was because of that sobering moment, because of that recognition. I am not the same as other people in society. Somebody can come and just throw stones or whatever it was, and eggs on me because they don't like that I am gay.
When you were talking earlier about whether or not this was unique, do you mean that this sort of example is, in your research, often relayed by gay men and lesbians?
Exactly.
Let's put up demonstrative 5, another example. And this is testimony from another of our plaintiffs, Sandra Stier. Question: are there occasions where you have to fill out forms that ask whether you are married or name of spouse or things like that? Answer: doctor's offices. Are you single or are you married or are divorced even? But so I have to find myself, scratching something out, putting a line through it and saying domestic partner, and making sure I explain to folks what that is to make sure that our transaction can go smoothly. We talked a good bit about forms already, but what's your reaction?
Again, that's an example of this form. But you have to think, or I guess you have to ask yourself, why would a person remember this type of minor incident? And as I mentioned before, I think the meaning of this incident is more important than, in this case, what has actually happened. So, like I said, if there was some error on this form where it says Mr. or Mrs., and somehow the words were not clear and she had to fix that, I don't think she would have reported that as a major, something that she remembers. But I think it is, again, the message that the forms, in a sense, echoes about rejection and about I'm not equal to other people, to most people who fill out this form.
So let's move to the second process that you talked about. Expectations of rejection and discrimination. What do you mean by that?
Expectations of rejection and discrimination actually mean exactly what it says. Expecting rejection and discrimination. But this is a very, to me, interesting process that occurs in populations that are used to prejudice. By used, I mean that they know about the prejudice that exists in society. And what happens is that a person who knows that they might be rejected or discriminated against needs to maintain a certain vigilance about their interactions in society that would, first of all, guarantee their safety. So an example that I often use when I talk about this is a gay couple walking down the street. In my experience, very often, regardless of how friendly their street is, they would have to monitor the kind of affection that they display with each other because somebody will come up and throw stones and eggs and so forth because they bring up something the person doesn't like. And again, it's not something about them as individuals, but about the fact that they are presenting as gay. So this would be one type of, as I call it, vigilance, that you have to be on edge, that you have to watch, you have to have a third eye looking, monitoring your environment. And this is a very stressful thing, if you think about it, that many people don't have to think about at all, think about any of that when they walk down the street with their partners.
Well, does the impact of expectation or rejection or discrimination go away if the rejection or discrimination doesn't happen?
Yeah, well, that's another interesting thing about expectation of rejection and discrimination, is that nothing really has to happen. And not only that, the persons involved in the environment may themselves not at all hold negative attitudes. So, in the sense, it is the expectation. It is not that this particular person may harm me. It is that what I represent may trigger in somebody. And it could be this person, but maybe it's not. So it doesn't have to be about anything specific about the persons involved in this interaction. I often give the example of being in a job interview and having to kind of monitor maybe how you're, what you're saying. And it doesn't mean, it doesn't matter what the people interviewing you actually think. It is that you're expecting that matters. That is what is stressful here. In addition to issues of safety, there are, as I just alluded to, issues around social intercourse where, since it can be very embarrassing or awkward, and we know that from stress literature, generally, many times people either choose to avoid those situations, swallow kind of minor incidents or prejudice or slurs or something, and just kind of move on because they don't want to get into that, so to speak. But the anticipation itself is what I'm talking about as stressful. You know, whether or not something happens, that has to do with a life event. But here we are talking about that anticipation.
So what if somebody concerned about having to be vigilant out on the street just stays inside and doesn't go out? Does that solve the problem for them?
Well, that would be quite a severe punishment for that person.
Is there a relationship, as you see it, Dr. Myers, between Proposition 8's denial of the opportunity to marry and this expectation of rejection and discrimination?
Yes.
And what is that connection?
Well, as I described earlier, in my mind, the Proposition 8, in its social meaning, sends a message that gay relationships are not to be respected, that they are of secondary value, if of any value at all, and that they are certainly not equal to those of heterosexuals. And to me, that's, in addition to achieving the literal aims of not allowing gay people to marry, it also sends a strong message about the values of the state, in this case, the Constitution itself. And it sends a message that would, in my mind, encourage or at least is consistent with holding prejudicial attitudes. So that doesn't add up to a very welcoming environment.
Let's talk about the third process now that you identify, which I think you described as concealing the stigmatized identity.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. If I may just mention one more concept that is related to stress, as we call it, the stress process, because it's relevant here. And that is the concept of coping. Coping is part of the stress process. And when we assess how does the stress affect the outcome, as I mentioned earlier, of health outcome, we really look at the balance between stress impact and what we call coping. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into coping. People talk about social support, but it is anything that we can say is positive impact on the health, that counters the negative impact of the stressor. The reason I bring it up here, because interesting thing, so concealing means I'm not going to reveal to other people that I am gay or lesbian. I'm going to hide that fact. But the interesting relationship with coping is that people conceal usually as a coping effort. They conceal so that they avoid some of the things that I described earlier, so that they're not fired from their job. If you're in the United States military, by law you have to conceal in that you are not allowed to talk about your homosexuality. So they conceal as an effort to, in this case, if you're a gay and you're in the military, you would conceal so that you don't get fired. But there are many other types of instances where people might find the need to conceal their sexual orientation. They might conceal it because they will feel that they will be rejected if other people know that they were gay. They may conceal it because of their personal safety, in the similar way that I described hate crimes, that they don't want people to recognize them as gay. They might not want to go to a place that is recognized as gay for fear that somebody might either hurt them, physically hurt them, or in other ways hurt them. So there are reasons that people choose to conceal what they themselves know about themselves, that they are gay or lesbian. And what the stress process here talks, so this is, but what the stress process is that there are many ways in which this kind of concealment are stressful. And I've written about at least maybe 3 ways. And again, all of this comes from research and literature that is not specific to the topic or to gay population. This is basing on general literature in various fields, in this case mostly psychology. So if you want, I can tell you about the particular ways that concealing can be stressful.